So welcome to our Anti-Trafficking Awareness Month webinar. My name is Ariel Curry and I am from the Eastern Territory. I am the anti-trafficking coordinator for this territory. These monthly webinars are hosted by the 4 territories. So myself, Hillary in the South, we have Joan in the Central Territory, and Jackie from the West. We have an amazing panel planned for you today, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I did want to let you all know that we will be doing monthly webinars. And so our next one is February 24th. It's actually up on sajustice.us. You can register for that. All of our webinars are free. And so the next one will be focused on motivational interviewing. We have a trainer in motivational interviewing, which has been a really helpful tool when working with survivors. Obviously, we only have about an hour to an hour and a half for these webinars, so it'll just be scratching the surface, but I think it's going to be an amazing time. So if you're interested, you can check back each month for the coming webinar. But again, the next one is up, so feel free to register for that. So since it is Anti-Trafficking Awareness Month, I know that there are a lot of incredible prevention and awareness events that are happening nationally. You can follow us on sajustice.us in terms of just following our website, but also on social media, whether it's on Instagram or Facebook. You can share our posts if you want to. That's a great way to just each day kind of spread awareness around human trafficking. Monday was Anti-Trafficking Awareness Day, which was deemed Anti-Trafficking Awareness Day by former President Barack Obama. And so that's why we chose this week to host the webinar. And so this is just a small way to really spread awareness. And so this webinar will be recorded and will be posted. So if there's someone who wasn't able to join today, who you were really hoping would be able to see this, you'll be able to, because we will post it on our website. So today we're focusing on myths and misconceptions. Now, typically, at least from what I've seen in the past, we have done maybe an HT 101 training or a red flags, but we wanted to do something a little bit different for this webinar. We wanted to focus on, there are a lot of things that we think to be true that oftentimes maybe aren't, or if you're not doing the work daily, that maybe you would assume. And so this is a great opportunity to really engage with experts who are in the field doing the work around particular myths. And so each panelist that we've had here, which I will introduce in a moment, has selected a myth or misconception to kind of bust or to speak through a little bit. And obviously, they each have anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to chat. So this is just, please know, scratching the surface and maybe not even scratching the surface. So we know that we're not able to address an issue in its entirety, but our hope is to just bring some awareness to the issues. And so before we jump in and I introduce everyone, I do want to do a trigger warning. I know some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today might be a little bit heavy for you or heavy for someone that you know who's on. And so feel free to take care of yourself. If you need to leave the webinar, if you need to pause it, take care of yourself, do whatever you need to do. But we did want to acknowledge that we know that this information is really heavy. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. So I'm going to read just briefly about their bio. These 4 individuals are very accomplished, and I probably took 2 sentences out of their page-long bios. And so again, this really doesn't scratch the surface into their accomplishments. So first, we have Diana Bussey, a BSW RSW, who serves in the Prairie Division of the Canada and Bermuda Territory as the Director of the Salvation Army's Correctional and Justice Services in Winnipeg. She's involved with relating to correctional programs, facilitating groups, group conferencing, mediation, parole supervision. Diana is passionate about ending human trafficking in all forms and became involved in the anti-oppression and restorative justice work early in her career as a social worker. So thank you, Diana. Next, we have Alex Baumgardner from Project Fight in North Carolina. Alex has her bachelor's degree in social work. She works directly with survivors of human trafficking in North Carolina as a regional case manager for Project Fight through the Salvation Army. Through Project Fight, Alex provides comprehensive case management services to survivors, conducts trainings in her community, collaborates with local partners who provide medical care, legal aid services, mental health support, and so much more for survivors. So thank you, Alex, for joining us. Next, we have Jen Harvey, who is a licensed social worker and has her master's degree with a concentration in mental health. She's the drop-in center coordinator for the Salvation Army's local anti-trafficking initiative, the Stop It program in Chicago. Through her work with Stop It, Jen has provided intensive case management services to survivors of sex and labor trafficking, conducts outreach trainings, coordinates services, and provides a number of other services to female identified youth and adults at the drop-in center. So thank you, Jennifer, for joining us. And lastly, we have Erin Myers, who has a master's in public policy with a focus on social policy and has been working with the anti-trafficking program at the Salvation Army in Cincinnati since its inception in May of 2012. Erin has also served as the coalition manager of End Slavery Cincinnati since November of 2011. She's responsible for the management of the human trafficking programming serving the Southwest Ohio area, including but not limited to oversight of case management, to trafficking victims in the areas, groups, outreach programming, 24-hour hotline, and a number of other direct services. So thank you, Erin, for joining us. Okay, we're gonna just jump right in. And so if you all have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A tab. We're gonna try to limit the questions in that, you'll see it at the bottom there. We will try our best to take a moment to answer questions at the end of each panelist, or if there are also questions at the very end, we'll do another opportunity to ask some more questions there. So the first person I'd like to talk with is Diana. So Diana, you chose the myth of physical violence being the main method that traffickers use when they're interacting with survivors. And so I think this is a really important topic. So I'd love to hear from you why often you think people assume that physical violence is really the only or the main source that traffickers are using.
Thank you, Ariel. And good afternoon or morning, I guess, as the case may be. It's great to be here to share with colleagues and with all of you on this webinar. So I guess I'll start by saying that other forms of control are often used that I think that we as maybe as the public or as helpers, as congregation members, even service workers, social workers, that these other forms of control other than physical violence, it makes it so that the human trafficking is not easily recognizable, right? So things like grooming and luring of young women towards sexual exploitation, prostitution, that situation of pretending to be a boyfriend or be the boyfriend kind of thing. These psychological manipulations are not recognized either by the trafficked person themselves. And so I guess I would describe the situations, I think, of what we've heard maybe as like the grass is greener. So traffickers would say, you know, they recognize that this is a potentially vulnerable person and say something like, hey, you know, I see your situation. It looks like you could use the money. I got this opportunity and this looks like a great thing. And then paints this beautiful picture about what life could be like, right? And so the traffickers are highly, highly adept at using subtle forms of manipulation along with shame and guilt and threats to keep a trafficked person, to get a trafficked person and keep that person in that situation. So these forms of control tend to be subtle, I think, in that. Just want to stop here and note that it is not my intent at all to minimize physical violence that is experienced by trafficked persons in any way, but rather to highlight that other forms of control, these other forms of control, because I think that those subtle psychological forms of manipulation keep human trafficking from being seen, right? By being seen by us as helpers, by community, and by the trafficked person themselves, as I was saying. I base my comments here today on experiences that our ministry unit of Salvation Army Corrections here in Winnipeg has had with doing programs with those who are victims. Or victimized. I don't really like the word victim, but those who are victimized. So with women, particularly who are exploited through prostitution. And so that's kind of what's forming the basis of these comments. And so what we've done for many years is we invite women in prostitution to get out of the city for 2 or 3 days of R&R. Really, like it would look like good food, good sleep, fun, crafts, and building positive relationships, like with each other, with those who can help, with a helping community. And so the sharing that takes place in those days is it's really hard to describe. We could do a whole thing just on that, but the sharing takes place maybe one-on-one, right? Where we're sitting down doing craft together, or it could be in small groups, over a meal, or just a time of sitting down together, or it could be a more formal in a focus group, right? Where we're really discussing like, what is human trafficking and what does it look like? So that's, I want to share a couple of trends from these conversations that we've had for many, many years and what we've seen. And the first one here is it's really, I can't unpack it in this time at all, but I'll leave it with you, but I'm going to quote it directly. But we've had lots and lots of comments again over a period of time that would be a similar comment. But so here it is that the quote is, "We," as in the trafficked person, exploited person, "we being out there helps women who are not used to this to not being raped." Right. So this describes that women who are exploited, trafficked into sex trafficking, feeling that they are sacrificing in some ways themselves to keep others safe. And that's sort of what we've heard over the years. Another point that we've heard is that trafficked persons we've met with have put the onus of their involvement on themselves and not on their trafficker, right? Or not on their pimp, and not recognizing that they were actually trafficked into it. So we've heard over and over again things like, well, my boyfriend and I needed the money, right? And then when we ask, how old were you? It's like, well, 15, 14, 13. Right. Or another, hearing lots of, I ran away from the group home and he gave me a place to stay, right? Or my auntie needed the money. So we've heard those things, lots of I, not he or she or they, but rather putting it on themselves. And so they, like the trafficked person, feels complicit in not only their current situation, but in how they got involved. And yet those are very, very specific techniques used by traffickers and by pimps. And so I just stop here to, I looked at the definition of subtlety, right? And I found a couple of quotes that really, I think, describe well these control techniques that traffickers use. One definition says subtlety means delicately complex and understated. And another quote was clever method of achieving something. So just keeping those in mind, these forms of control make human trafficking harder to detect, make the trafficked person feel like they are to blame by breaking down their sense of self-worth and their dignity. And it increases in the difficulty in their getting out, right? That sense of worthlessness and complicity that is created by the trafficker, by that control, is a super powerful tool for them, unfortunately. Because of all this, though, and these are my closing comments, and because of all this, it is so important to ensure that when we help people who are victimized by trafficking, when we help survivors, that the survivors, the trafficked persons, have control of their healing and their decisions, right? And this allows for their sense of identity as God's beautiful creations to start to grow and grow. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. And I wanted to just respond to you made a great point that continuing to believe that physical violence is the main source that traffickers use really does the survivors a disservice in a number of different ways. But especially in terms of knowing what really to look for, whether it's with law enforcement. If you're just looking for physical violence or bruising or things like that, we're really missing probably majority of the survivors. While physical violence might be part of a lot of their story, we also know that emotional abuse, coercion, things that you can't quite visibly see, psychological abuse, manipulation, all of those things, you can't see with your eyes. And so I cannot tell you the amount of times that when I've worked in our drop-in center in Philadelphia, I'd had volunteers who were interacting with survivors for days, and eventually they would say, when are the victims of trafficking going to come in? I thought we were serving victims of trafficking. And they weren't being rude. They just were assuming that they were going to see someone who had bruising, or a pimp that wasn't leaving their side, or someone who was saying, rescue me, all of these things that I feel like maybe we see in the media a lot. And so I won't go too much down that road, but I think what's important to recognize is one, that physical violence is often used, but it is often not used. And there are so many other tactics that traffickers are really using to control victims of trafficking. And so thank you for sharing that with us, Diana. It was helpful. Great. Um, so we're going to go on to Alex. Alex, I know the myth that you chose, or maybe some confusion between smuggling versus trafficking, and this assumption that in order to be trafficked, it has to be maybe across state lines, or how we've seen it maybe in Taken or Law and Order SVU, or someone being thrown in the back of a van. And sometimes we can really confuse smuggling with trafficking. And so can you speak to the difference of this, and also in your experience, how most individuals are in fact being trafficked?
Yeah, definitely. So once again, good afternoon, everybody. And yeah, it's pretty common for folks to assume that trafficking has to involve moving or traveling of people, but in all actuality, it's that's human smuggling, which involves illegal border crossings. And so human trafficking itself doesn't actually require movement of any kind. Victims can be recruited and trafficked without ever even leaving their homes. And so for the next few minutes, I'll share some of the numbers that are out there, as well as some personal experiences I've had in my line of work, in order to further expand on that. To start and get a general idea, the US Department of State's 2019 Trafficking in Persons report tells us that 77% of trafficking victims are exploited just within their own country of residence. And so it goes on to say that the prevalence of human trafficking is difficult to measure, which I feel like is important to speak on, in the fact that it is true, like generally due to the nature and the barriers that come with reporting, usually trafficking statistics don't entirely capture the extent of it and the prevalence of it. But regardless, however, a number of international organizations have estimated that traffickers exploit a majority of victims without ever moving them from one country to another. So, and then another report is the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. In 2018, they put out a report that said that the clear majority of traffickers were citizens in countries that they were convicted. And so that also counters this myth that most traffickers are foreign nationals. And to speak on more personal experience, here in North Carolina, Project Fight serves all 100 counties. And so I put out a little poll to my coworkers across the state and asked them, and currently Project Fight's working with over 20 survivors who have been trafficked out of their hometowns solely. So they never left the state, they never left the country. And after further discussion, we found that even the clients that we were serving who did cross state or international borders started off being trafficked in their own homes, or other own hometowns, I will say. And so these facts just continue to kind of break that misconception that you were speaking on, Ariel, that, it always looks like the movie Taken, or the idea that only foreign nationals are trafficked in the US, perhaps. So while we acknowledge the fact that there certainly are victims who are trafficked throughout various countries, it's imperative that we shed light on the fact that based on the work that we've seen, a large majority of them are trafficked just in areas that they reside in. And so there are most likely a number of reasons that contribute to this, but based on my work experience, one of the biggest reasons is because most survivors that I've worked with were trafficked by folks that they knew very well beforehand. And so because like Diana talked about, a lot of much like other forms of abuse, there is typically a grooming process involved long before the trafficking ever takes place. And so to elaborate on that, out of my entire caseload, that I have right now, I only have one client who was ever trafficked by a stranger that her friends introduced her to. And so it's understandable if you think about it that if you're being trafficked by somebody you know, you're probably going to stay within that community or that network, even if not everyone in your own life knows that you're being trafficked. So for example, one survivor advocate that I met once, she was trafficked by a family member all throughout her middle school and high school years, and her parents had no idea. And she lived at home. I mean, she had divorced parents, so there was, they weren't always on the same page, and there were like things that fell through the cracks, and that was how it was managed to be done without the parents ever knowing. And so to get back to my point, aside from that one client that was trafficked by the strangers, out of all the traffickers that my clients had as of now, or had in the past, I made a list, and it was somebody's husband, someone's boyfriend, some kids' grandparents, a boss, a fiance, someone's father and grandfather, someone's boyfriend and his friends, another set of grandparents, another boyfriend, and a religious cult that the survivor grew up a part of. So that kind of gives you an idea that it's typically people that are very close to you. And that's why, it's very important to also recognize that traffickers don't look one sort of way. It looks like grandparents, it looks like cousins, it looks like, fiancés and family members. And so when it goes back to geography, out of all of my current clients right now, only one of them was trafficked across international borders. The rest of them were trafficked in their own hometowns or cities that they had been living in at the time. And many of them were trafficked out of their own homes. And so 2 of them were coerced into coming into the US under false pretenses, only to be trafficked upon arrival. And then 5 of them were trafficked in their own home countries and sought refuge here in the States. But aside from that, the rest of my clients are American-born survivors. And so I say all that to say because understanding the truth of countering the human smuggling misconception is really important to understand, because if we don't expect victims to be foreign nationals, perhaps, or expect them to fit into this mold that the media and action thriller movies have given us, which essentially tells us that survivors are being transported from one state or one country to another, then we're going to miss those who really need our support in our own backyards. And the fact is vulnerable, and valuable people are being trafficked in your own communities, regardless of how rural or urban they are. And so we need to create safe spaces for them when or if they choose to reach out. And so what are some ways that can be done? A few different things, but one is that you can support your local substance recovery center. I would say, if I had to guess, like approximately 8 out of 10 survivors that Project Fight works with typically face substance use addiction when they're coming out of their trafficking, because many times traffickers use drugs and alcohol to keep survivors subdued or dependent on them. And support your local behavioral health centers. As one can imagine, with trafficking comes a lot of complex trauma. And, if violence wasn't used, sometimes that trauma bond is. And a lot of times those things can go hand in hand. But there's an extensive amount of counseling and therapy and mental health support that is necessary to address in a survivor's recovery journey. if that is something that they choose to do. But if they choose to do it, we have to make it affordable and available for folks to use. And some other things are support your local free clinics, your food pantries, your social service agencies, and of course, especially if they specialize in providing services to human trafficking survivors. Because I say all these because many times these essential workers that are in these places are who are seeing victims that are coming to them generally in crisis. And if survivors can get wraparound support that they need, many times that increases the chances that they will leave their trafficking situation because they see like there is actually resources available out them and they don't have to be dependent on the trafficker despite what traffickers might tell them. And so ultimately, I want to make it clear that despite what some media outlets may communicate, the reality is children are being sex and labor trafficked and continuing to go to school. People are being labor trafficked out of your local fisheries and restaurants and logging companies and massage parlors and more. And people of every economic status and gender identity are sexually exploited throughout our neighborhoods. And so we have to learn the red flags so that we can offer support however they need it here and not necessarily how we think that they need it in order to make it that safe space. And so my final points to wrap up are if you believe that you are witnessing a survivor in your own line of work, give them the chance to have self-determination, which means essentially don't assume that they want to be rescued in that moment. And don't assume that, yeah, they're going to have the shackles or the bruises that you would imagine. And instead offer the assistance of whatever they're seeing you for. And if it's safe to do so, you know, and if it's something that you know the red flags and there's enough present that warrants a response, you know, you can gently let them know that there are resources available out there for them if they are ever in the dangerous situation. So not even necessarily assuming if they don't disclose to you, then just say, you know, just so you know down the line, if something ever comes up and you're in a dangerous situation, X, Y, and Z is available. And then lastly, if you believe that you're witnessing a situation that is involving human trafficking that is outside of your line of work, so, you know, somebody isn't directly coming to you for services necessarily, then you can always call and make a tip to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And you never ever have to be sure that it's actually human trafficking. I think it can be really nerve-wracking for people to make that call, which is very understandable. I still remember the first time I made that call and I wasn't sure. So, but that's okay. It just adds to data for people to potentially make a case or to just put it out there for local providers in the area to be aware of in case it is something. And so I always recommend that people put the hotline number in their phone so that they can have it in the case of an emergency. And so if you don't have that number, we can put in the chat box, but the number is 1-888-373-7888. And for more information on the facts behind these things and other things that we're talking about today, you can always visit the National Human Trafficking Hotline website, which is just www.humantraffickinghotline.org, excuse me. And you can actually find more information that's specific to the state that you live in. And then if you are in the southern region, you can always visit our website at projectfight.org and follow us on social media under Project Fight. So I appreciate all y'all's time today.
Ariel, if I can just jump in and just say there are a couple of questions for Alex.
Yeah.
So the first one, I'll give you both at the same time because they may overlap a little. The first one is, why does the media push that false narrative about smuggling? And then the second one is there a difference with this in labor trafficking versus sex trafficking?
That's a really great question. So to address the media, I know Erin, I think, is going to discuss that a little bit more, but essentially it's because it's not quite as, you know, sensationalized as the reality is. And unfortunately, it's easier to, I think, create a story around something that plays into the narrative of what like the movies that we've seen and, you know, the TV shows that we watch versus the reality of like, you know, somebody on the street that struggles with substance use or mental health issues that can be like a little bit more messy or feel a little bit more complex, versus somebody that is just like asking to be rescued from a clear-cut situation. So I think, in short, it's just the complexity of the situation that can be like really difficult for others to understand. And I'd like to think another reason is just a lack of education on the media's end as well, and which is just another reason to, you know, make it important to raise awareness of the realities. And not that the media always gets it wrong, but just expanding that view of what human trafficking looks like. And then to answer the second question, for labor trafficking, yeah, it can look a little bit different in terms of the means of like coerciveness that folks can be, because I think a lot of times with labor trafficking, the vulnerabilities can sometimes look a little different in terms of like their financial situation, that they're wanting that line of work. But a lot of times sex and labor trafficking does overlap. But in terms of the smuggling myth, it goes for labor trafficking as well. A lot of times folks can be, yeah, labor trafficked out of, you know, their own place, and they don't also have to be transported. But just based on my experience, a lot of my labor trafficking folks do tend to not be from the US, but we do see people that are US born. I think a lot of times it can just be easy for the H-2A visas and H-2B visas to be taken advantage of for folks that end up staying here and taking advantage of a vulnerable situation, if that makes sense. Hopefully that answers your question.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. And
Yeah,
thanks for just your wisdom. I think it's helpful to just realize that also each community, the individuals and the trafficking situation can look differently. And I know at times it could feel overwhelming of like, it could look like this, it could look like this, it could look, you know, and the reality is that, that, you know, that is true, that it can present very different in each community. So thanks for sharing. And we're going to move on to Erin. I think it's a great segue. And so, Erin, I know you're going to talk to us a little bit about this idea of sensationalism and the media and language around it, and conspiracies, and you have a lot to cover here today, and I'm really looking forward to it. But can you speak to us a little bit about, yeah, sometimes why is the media, or it often seems like the media is covering just one type of victim, or focusing on the violence, or it feels like even the way that they look, they're focusing on a particular victim. Or even recently in the media, I know this is a lot, there's trafficking has kind of popped up in the media a ton in this past, I want to say 6 or so months. So can you just share your perspective on that?
Sure. Thanks, Ariel. And thanks to Alex, who's also touched on some of these components as well. Yeah, I mean, I think when we're thinking about this particular topic, people have a particular vision in their mind of what a trafficking situation looks like, what that survivor looks like, what that perpetrator looks like, and what that experience was like. I don't think human trafficking is unique in that way. I think there's a lot of victimizations that we like to put into boxes. I think we could spend days on discussions of why our psyche wants to do that, and I'm not going to do that today. I do encourage everybody who wants to learn more about ACEs and kind of listen a little bit about some of that to visit the TED Talk conducted by Nadine Burke-Harris. I see some head nodding. Maybe you've already seen it before, but it delves a little bit into that. But mostly talks about ACEs, but talks a little bit about why our society likes to think of trauma in a certain light. And so you know, when we think about that, the media plays its role in that. I think, you know, we are a sensationalized culture. We do, you know, we do the media generally is telling stories that grab people's attention. Sometimes those stories are of something positive and cute that happened, but oftentimes when it's something that surrounds, a trauma, it's more often focused on kind of the extremes of those ends. I know that our coalition has worked diligently with our partners to try to develop a media toolkit to try to, which I'd be happy to share, to try to help inform our media partners on the kind of do's and don'ts of how to talk about this issue, the some of the language surrounding it, and some of the just kind of help inform media that it isn't this. I think what most of the time people think of is, children, minors, specifically sex trafficking, and oftentimes white, and that's not the trafficking survivors that we see. We see a very diverse group, coming from varying backgrounds, having had varying experiences, as has already been touched on by my fellow panelists here today. And so again, I think we could talk a lot about sensationalism and why it exists. But what I think is important for us to acknowledge is how we can take those media components and really do what we can to not propagate those stereotypes, which obviously it starts by us ourselves being informed. Again, when you think about the information that's out there, statistics are somewhat unreliable, I would say. There are some good studies out there that have good methodologies and have been validated by other researchers, and that is great. There are also some that are not so great and or some that are old, and well-meaning people see them and continue to share them, but don't realize that maybe they're 15 years old and are no longer true to what we see with trafficking. It's not to say that they weren't true or that trafficking has somehow molded, but more just as we've learned more and more about this issue, as more and more cases have come to light, we've just learned more about what it can look like, how it can be experienced. And obviously, as technology changes, as other things change, that can change the whole of the trafficking experience as well. And so when we think of these conspiracy theories or other information that's shared online that can really that can be based in falsehoods, it can be hard to spot those. And I think as advocates, as advocates on this issue, we can do our best to be informed, to acknowledge those, and to try to counteract them with accurate information. I say that with caution, though. Obviously, we don't want to be engaging in any kind of like Facebook wars online and alienating people incidentally by just who just may not be as informed and just may see something and be kind of caught up in the emotions that it evokes. And so we can do that again by cautiously sharing correct information, by being engaging, by being supportive. Ariel started this conversation with a trigger warning. We don't do that for our general conversations, but part of the sensationalism is that people, that we have these traumas, we have this, but we also have this empathy side that we all have, and we all want to be supporting people. And so we may kind of get caught up without meaning to be. And so being as informed and understanding of that is something that can be really helpful as an advocate, as a leader in your community on this issue. And I just want, I know I don't have a lot of time, and I don't even remember what time I started. I apologize, and I talk a lot. So I'm going to assume that I've talked too much and start to kind of close out. But again, when we're thinking of this, I think it's really important that we, even though these conspiracy theories and these kind of sensationalized commentary can bring attention to this issue, attention is not always good. It's good that people care about this issue, that they want to learn about it, and maybe that they've become aware of it by this end. But it's also important that as advocates, as informed advocates, that we not ignore these or leave them to be just kind of consumed by our communities. I know that we had an experience where one of the common Facebook threads kind of got through our community, and unfortunately a less than reputable organization, which it's not really an organization, but somebody who claimed to be a trafficking advocate used that to their benefit and got a lot of people to donate and use that money for her personal gain, in addition to endangering survivors, because she felt like she needed to do something but was not informed or prepared to do so. And so, again, unknowing people, we're just trying to be helpful, and then we're inadvertently potentially harming individuals. But and I think even just that misspreading of those misconceptions can harm survivors, because they can see those misconceptions, and then might be less willing to come forward thinking that's not me. And so the more that we can share that this human trafficking experience is a broad one, it's a diverse one, and that we support that with facts, the better we're going to be advocating for the identification of this issue in our community and the healthy supporting of survivors in our communities as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin.
I can just jump in with a question for anyone who wants to answer this one, I think. Are any of the panelists ever called to testify as experts in criminal cases? If the media gets the image of human trafficking wrong, I can imagine that there is also a lot of room for educating jurors as well.
I'll jump in quickly, and I will say absolutely. So that is a great point. And that's part of why I know for us, we run a coalition in addition to running a victim services program. And part of our mission is to educate the community, because it is not a one-sided effort. We really need the community to understand so that people can, particularly law enforcement, can identify appropriately and then coordinate with services, even if it doesn't fit that box that the media or others promote. And then also to ensure that then on that other side, jurors can identify it and prosecutors can feel comfortable pushing for a trial because they feel confident that jurors will understand it, as opposed to feeling that they have to go with a lesser charge deal, which is what happens very often in our communities, which is why there is not a great deal of human trafficking prosecutions in our nation, partially because prosecutors do not feel confident that jurors understand it and will support. I mean, that's a broad statement, but that's been my experience. So yes, I think educating as much as possible. And yes, we've been called to testify before as well, because so often it's something that prosecutors and the courts feel that they need to inform jurors on, that it's not something that jurors just readily are aware of or understand the nuances of.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, I think the common thread here that we're going to see over and over again is the reason it's so important to kind of bust these myths and speak truth is it ultimately allows us to support victims and survivors better, whether it is in a courtroom, for law enforcement, for when we can actually understand the victimology of survivors and how they're going to present and how different it is from what we see in the media, the more of an opportunity we have to really identify survivors, to be able to support them in an appropriate way. And so I think these conversations are so important. So thank you for sharing that, Erin. It was really helpful. I want to be mindful of time. So I'm going to move on to Jennifer. So Jennifer, you selected the myth, or maybe the topic around this rescue mentality. And I think we often assume that survivors are going to jump into our arms and say, save me, help me, you're amazing, and all these things that we assume. And, if I'm being honest, earlier on in my career, I assumed that that's how survivors would present to me. And so it's no fault of our own in a lot of ways. But I'm excited to hear you share and your perspective around kind of the savior complex and rescue mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, I resonate with that so much. I can't tell you how many times I've told people what my line of work is, and I get this reaction that I'm some sort of, I don't know, angel hero person. And really, day to day, I don't actually feel like I'm helping people because I'm just walking alongside people, and kind of there for what comes up. So as I'm listening to my fellow panelists, I'm realizing how much we have touched on this and this idea of savior complex, rescue mentality. So I'll try and tie up some of loose ends that we haven't hit. But when I say rescue mentality, I think to me what that means is a mentality of hearing about the horrors of trafficking and being of course appalled by it and wanting to act in a lot of urgency. And so because the crime is so horrendous, we often want to meet that intensity in our response when really, as people have said, the response that survivors need is often slow, steady, and consistent, and it can take years. And when we have this perception of needing to rescue people, to expect people to want help, it assumes a lot of things wrongfully that hurts the movement at large, and of course survivors as well. I think the first thing it assumes is just that it's enough. And like I just said, and like other people have touched on, the damage of psychological control is pervasive, right? And so just because we're removing someone from the situation does not mean that they don't have the risks of leaving and that it outweighs those risks, right? And it also assumes that trafficking is straightforward. And I don't want to minimize the crimes of kidnapping or physical confinement or anything like that or smuggling. But in our local context, like others have said, we see this intentional grooming and manipulation of relationships, often existing relationships, preying on false promises and vulnerabilities. And yeah, if we saw trafficking to be this innocent bystander walking along, getting pulled into a van, forced in something they don't want to do, that person is more probable to receive and ask for help when it comes along. Um, but if we're seeing a trafficker who is intentionally seeking out someone who is needing love, support, community, basic needs, opportunities, and lacking those things, it's going to be really hard to tease out. It also assumes that we're the experts and puts us on a pedestal as helper, um, when really I wouldn't ever want a stranger coming up to me and telling me how to live my life or what I need or what help looks like. We sometimes have no idea what help and safety looks like for folks. And I see this all the time. For example, if I'm helping at a sting operation and law enforcement or other providers are baffled why someone doesn't want to go to a shelter. Often it's because maybe they were hurt in a shelter before. We never know what is safe for people. I've had people who'd rather stay in a park overnight than in a warm bed in a shelter. And by assuming that ultimately is breaking any chance that we have of trust, for building with that person. I also see that with cell phones a lot, right? Rightfully so. Sometimes when people go to stay in shelters out of care and safety so that people don't contact their trafficker, don't get contacted by them, often their cell phones are put up, right? But for that person, it might feel unsafe to be without their cell phone. I know that's how I feel. And so again, this perception of like, I know what you need, I know what's going to be healing, can often be really incongruent with what is actually safe and helpful for people. And along those lines, it assumes that we can dictate when people are ready for change. And I think if we looked at any other behavior patterns, cyclical attachments, such as substance abuse or anything like that, we would know that people can only change when they're ready, right? So if we are extracting people from a situation and putting them in something really unfamiliar or new or just jolting, we're setting people up for failure, which can ultimately keep perpetuating that cycle of going back to the life or whatever employment situation they were in with the trafficking. trafficking. And so it's problematic on a number of levels, but a couple things I want to hit on quickly is just, I think other people have really talked about this a lot, but it truly misidentifies who the survivors are and who the perpetrators are. Again, if we are looking for someone who is ready for help, we are not going to find survivors of trafficking, because often people do not know that they're even being trafficked. I can't tell you the number of people in the drop-in center who, by all means, fit the legal definition of trafficking, but have never heard that word before, never knew that they had rights in those situations. It's just what has happened in their family. It's just what they're used to. It's just what has needed to happen. And often people think that they chose that, right? When we know that in this complexity of a crime, consent is really warped and not necessarily true. Um, and the other thing is just that the rescue mentality is not victim centered or empowering, and it has the probability of putting us at the same level of trafficker, which sounds extreme. But if we are in the position of, again, telling people what they need, rescuing them in a way that they're not asking for, ultimately, what our brains do under trauma is it categorizes things to keep us safe, right? And so if they're under the control of a trafficker for a long time, our brains are going to start to flag anything that is trying to control us, right? And put in a category to protect us. And so it doesn't matter if we have the positive spin on it of telling people what to do and how. Ultimately, it's going to be in the same box of controlling behavior, and people are going to write us off and not want help when they're ready for it. Um, and it really puts us at a distance from any survivor. It others and distance people. And so it allows us to be hero and renders the survivor to be helpless to us. And so it really slows down the process of empowering. I think it's actually mutually exclusive. I don't think rescuing and empowering can happen at the same time, because it's saying, look, I believe in you. I believe you have the power to lead a meaningful, hopeful life, but you need me to help you to do it. And so it creates further dependency when we're actually trying to help people get out of dependency from their trafficker. Um, and I think other people have touched on this too, but it can be practically just really unsafe and dangerous to get involved. And so sometimes the rescue mentality actually materializes into people without necessarily the credentials behind it to extricate people and to go to intense means of trying to help, having people stay in their homes without being prepared for what that looks like, in the name of generosity and doing the most. And so I just want to name that um, that is the job of law enforcement. It's the job of people who are trained, because ultimately, not only can it put you at harm, but it ultimately puts the people who are under the control of trafficker at harm, because there can be really violent repercussions for folks who even talk to someone or look at someone who the trafficker does not approve of. I could go on, but I do want to leave room for questions if we're wrapping up in a few minutes. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think what you said about even just the word rescue is so important, and the language that we use around this issue. I know a lot of well-intended people will use the word rescue a lot, and even just that verbiage can really create a hierarchy within the helping relationship, even if our intent is good. And so um, unintentionally really creating this parallel process of the trafficking situation with the survivor. And so our language matters. Even if our heart is in the right place, that's a great start, but also the language that you use in trainings and to other folks that you work with. And so we encourage folks to try to steer clear of even the word rescue, and maybe use the word recover, or, because really this is a helping relationship, and we're walking alongside of the survivor, but they really are the expert to their own story. And we're just a small kind of part of that. And so thank you for sharing your perspective. It was really helpful. And thank you to all of the panelists for taking a moment to just share a little insight with us on these common myths and misconceptions around trafficking. I know that we are just about out of time, but I wanted to leave a moment for any other questions to come in. In the Q&A, feel free to get your last questions before we wrap up. And while I wait for that, I just want to again thank our panelists, but also put a plug in for our upcoming webinar for the 24th of February. You can register. It's open, it's free, up on sajustice.us for our motivational interviewing training that we have coming up. So it doesn't look like there are any other questions. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, spending an hour of your Wednesday with us. I think we had great dialogue, and we look forward to seeing you all next month. So thank you so much. Oh, and also I will say that Erin just put in the TED Talk in the comments. As well as the hotline number was in there. It's probably going to quickly disappear. So feel free to reach out to any of your territorial reps, and we can connect you with whether it's the TED Talk, the hotline number, anything that we covered today. Feel free to reach out to your representative and we can connect you with the correct information. So thanks again and have a great day.